I said it quietly, in Mandarin, just loud enough for my mother-in-law to hear. She froze. The soup spoon stopped halfway to her mouth, and the whole table went silent in a way that had nothing to do with good manners. My name is David Park. I'm 51 years old. I teach high school history in Oakville, Ontario, and until that Saturday evening in March, I had spent nearly a decade convincing myself that I was a lucky man. My wife, May, was brilliant. Quick with a laugh, sharper than most people gave her credit for, and she made the best kanji I'd ever tasted. We met at a conference in Toronto. She was presenting research on immigrant integration policy. I was there because my principal had voluntarily signed up every department head for a weekend of professional development and then bailed himself. We taught through the entire lunch break and half of dinner. 6 months later, she moved into my place in Oakville. 2 years after that, we had our daughter, Sophie. Sophie was 7 when everything fell apart. She had May's eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin, and she was the kind of kid who corrected the grammar and her teacher's written feedback. I was never not proud of her. The dinner that March was a birthday celebration. May's mother was turning 68, and her parents had flown in from Vancouver, where they'd lived since immigrating from Chengdu in the early 90s. My father-in-law, Raymond, was a retired civil engineer who spoke careful, deliberate English and always shook my hand firmly, like he was trying to calibrate the exact right pressure. My mother-in-law, Linda, spoke almost no English at all, or so I was led to believe. She smiled at me pleasantly and communicated through May, who translated selectively. I later understood. What nobody at that table knew, nobody except me, was that I had spent 4 years in China. I had gone when I was 24, young and directionless after a relationship ended badly, and my career plans felt suddenly like someone else's. A friend teaching English in Chengdu said there was an opening at his school. I said yes before I finished reading the email. I ended up staying far longer than I planned. First in Chengdu, then a year in Chongqing, then 2 years in Shanghai, where I eventually worked as a translator and contract interpreter for a Canadian trade office. By the time I came back to Canada, I was nearly 29, fluent in Mandarin. Not textbook fluent, but lived-in fluent, the kind where you dream in it and swear in it and tell jokes badly in it. And I had learned more about myself than I'd wanted to. When I met May, I mentioned China once, early on during that first dinner. She'd asked if I'd ever been, and I said yes. I'd lived there for a bit, and somehow we moved on before I elaborated. After that, the subject didn't come up naturally, and I never forced it. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't some long game I was playing. May's relationship with her cultural identity was complicated in ways I didn't fully understand yet, and I was careful not to step on anything. And then a year passed, and it started to feel strange to bring it up, like correcting someone on a name you've been mispronouncing for months. The longer I said nothing, the more impossible it felt to say something. When her parents visited, May always spoke Mandarin with them. I always smiled and nodded and waited for the translated summary. It became normal. It became invisible. So that Saturday in March, Linda was seated across from me at our dining room table, the good one we reserve for guests, and May was in the kitchen finishing the fish, and Sophie was upstairs being convinced by her Uncle Wei Si's younger brother, who'd also flown in, to come down and be sociable. Raymond was telling me in careful English about a plumbing issue he'd had in his Vancouver condo. I was listening with genuine interest because I genuinely like plumbing as a conversation topic, which says something about where I was at in life. Then May called from the kitchen for Wei to come help her carry something, and Raymond went to use the bathroom, and suddenly it was just Linda and me at the table. She looked at me. I smiled. She looked toward the kitchen. Then she took out her phone and sent a text message. Her phone buzzed. She read the reply. And then very quietly, as if continuing a conversation she'd been having in her head, she spoke in Mandarin. She wasn't talking to me. She wasn't aware that there was any reason to talk to me. She was just thinking out loud in the only language that felt like thinking. She said, "They still haven't told him. May keeps delaying." I reached for my water glass and took a slow sip. A few seconds later, Wei appeared briefly in the doorway from the kitchen, not quite entering the room, and Linda said to him, also in Mandarin, "How much longer can she keep this up, the money situation alone?" And Wei made a sharp gesture with his hand and glanced at me and said later, and went back into the kitchen. Raymond came back from the bathroom. The moment sealed over like ice on a pudding. But I had heard it, and I understood every word. The dinner itself was fine. The fish was excellent. Sophie came downstairs and sat beside me and whispered that Uncle Wei had promised her $20 to be charming, which she found insulting, and I told her she was worth at least 50. Linda watched us with her pleasant smile and said something to May that May translated as, "She says Sophie is getting so big," which may or may not have been accurate. After dinner, while May and her mother washed up, I took Raymond and Wei onto the back deck with 2 fingers of 40 Creek each and let Raymond steer the conversation to hockey, which he had developed a passionate and somewhat bewildering investment in since moving to Vancouver. I said the right things about the Leafs. I laughed at the right moments. I knew even then, performing normalcy with the precision of a man who had just heard something and not yet decided what to do about it. When her family left the next morning and May was loading the dishwasher, I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her for a while. I said, "Good visit." She said, "Good visit," and smiled at me, and I smiled back. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the carpet for about 10 minutes. Here is what I knew. Something was being kept from me. It involved money. It involved a delay, something May was postponing telling me, and it was serious enough that her family was tracking it by text message at the dinner table. Here is what I didn't know, whether it was something that would merely hurt or something that would change everything. I am, by nature and by profession, a patient man. I teach teenagers about events that happened centuries ago and try to make them feel why it mattered. You learn to wait for the right moment to let a thing land. So I waited. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm not ashamed of it either. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't before. May had always handled our finances. It was an arrangement that had evolved organically. She was better at it, more organized, and I was happy to defer. I handled the house maintenance and the school logistics and the 100 small physical tasks that kept our life running. She handled the money. I trusted her completely. I started looking. It took me 3 weeks to understand what I was seeing, and another 2 weeks to be sure. Our joint savings account, which should have had somewhere around $80,000 in it. Money we had been accumulating for a decade, for a reno, for Sophie's education, for retirement, had been drained to just under $12,000. The withdrawals were small and spread out and routed through a secondary account I hadn't known existed. It was careful. It was deliberate. It had been going on for 2 years. I am not a dramatic man. I did not throw anything. I did not confront May that night, or the night after, or the week after that. I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Sung, and she was referred to me by a colleague, and she had the calm, almost bored efficiency of someone who had heard every version of this story and found them all equally solvable. She told me what to document and how. I documented. Then, because I needed to understand the full shape of it, I did something I am still not entirely comfortable with. On a Friday evening in April, when May took Sophie to a birthday party, I sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I thought about what her mother had said. They still haven't told him. The money situation alone. The money was one part. But there was something else being kept from me, something May was delaying telling me, and her mother had framed it as separate from, but connected to, the money. I thought about the past 2 years. Not dramatically, practically. I thought about trips May had taken for work, a conference in Montreal, a research trip to Ottawa, a weekend visiting a graduate student she mentored. I thought about the times she'd been distracted in ways I had attributed to stress. I thought about a name I'd seen in her phone once. Briefly, not snooping, just the lock screen notification, a name I didn't recognize and hadn't asked about because I was the kind of husband who didn't ask about things like that. The name was Daniel. I hired someone to do what I could not do myself because I am a high school history teacher and not a private investigator, and I know the limits of my own competencies. 3 weeks later, I had what I needed, and what I needed was more than I had prepared myself for. Daniel Whitmore, 38, an architect based in Toronto. He and May had been seeing each other for approximately 26 months. Sophie was 7. I did the arithmetic and then I put the paper down and looked out the window at our backyard, at the cedar deck I'd built 3 summers ago, at the garden beds May had planted with Sophie last May, and I thought about a conversation we'd had when May was pregnant, late at night, lying in the dark, about whether we wanted another child, and May had said not yet. Let's see how we are with one, and I had said, okay, I trust you. I called Patricia Sung. She was quiet for a moment when I told her. Then she said, practically, Have you considered a paternity test? I had. I had been considering it for 3 days and had been unable to move past the consideration into the action because the action felt like detonating something that couldn't be undetonated. But I knew I needed to know. You cannot make decisions in the dark. Sophie had a dental appointment the following week. Afterward, she sat in the car eating the sugar-free lollipop the hygienist had given her, and she put it down on the wrapper in her lap and said something to me about a girl at school, and I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And she leaned into my hand for a second the way she had since she was small. I collected what I needed. I sent it to a lab in Mississauga. 14 days later, I had my answer. I want to be precise about this, because I think it matters. My first feeling was not rage. It was not devastation. It was a kind of terrible clarity, like when you've been trying to read something in bad light for a long time and someone finally turns on a lamp. Everything I had been sensing without being able to name suddenly had a name. And then, underneath that, something about Sophie that I cannot fully articulate even now. She was mine. That was not a thought I had. It was a fact I already knew. The paper in my hand did not tell me that Sophie was not mine. It told me that a man named Daniel Whitmore existed in the world, and that had nothing to do with who my daughter was, or who I was to her, or who I would be to her going forward. That was the moment, I think, when I stopped feeling like a man things were happening to and started feeling like a man making decisions. I'm telling this in the order I experienced it, which means I haven't yet gone to the second dinner. It was June. May's parents were visiting again. They came 3 or 4 times a year, and Sophie adored her grandparents, and whatever was happening between May and me had not yet broken the surface, so the visit was proceeding normally. I had said nothing. Patricia Sung had advised me to say nothing until the documentation was complete. The second dinner was a Sunday. We ordered in barbecue chicken from a place on Lakeshore that Sophie loved, and we sat around the same table, and it was the same configuration. Raymond careful and deliberate in English, Linda pleasant and smiling in my direction, Wei making Sophie laugh by pulling faces behind May's back. And I thought, I understand all of this. I am sitting here at my own table, in my own house, and everyone in this room believes I cannot understand them, and I can't understand all of them. It wasn't a plan, or maybe it was, but I hadn't labeled it as one. About 40 minutes in, Wei mentioned something to May in Mandarin, and May responded with something short that I recognized as dismissive, and Linda leaned over to say something quietly to May, and what she said was, "He seems to be in a very good mood today. Has he noticed anything?" And May said, also quietly, also in Mandarin, "Number, he doesn't notice things like that. He's not that kind of person. Doesn't notice things like that." I reached for the hot sauce and took my time with it. Then Raymond said something. He'd been following the Mandarin conversation on the side while conducting a different one with me in English, which is its own kind of skill. And what he said was, "Is the situation with Daniel resolved? Does he know about the arrangement?" And May said, "Not yet. I keep thinking I'll find the right moment." I looked at Sophie. She was trying to balance a piece of chicken on the end of her fork and not paying attention to any of us. I put down my hot sauce. I picked up my water glass. And I looked at Linda and I said in Mandarin, in the clearest Mandarin I had, the Chengdu inflected Mandarin I'd learned 25 years ago and never quite lost, "I hope the food is to your liking." Linda's reaction was extraordinary. It happened in layers, like watching a building come apart from the top down. First the eyes, a rapid involuntary blinking. Then the color, which left her face so completely and so fast that she seemed to become a different version of herself. Then her hands, which went flat on the table as if she needed to verify that the surface was still solid. May had gone very still. Wei was staring at me. Raymond put down his fork. I smiled pleasantly. "I'm sorry," I said, still in Mandarin. "I should have mentioned I spent 4 years in China when I was in my 20s. Chengdu, Chongqing, Shanghai. I worked as an interpreter for a while. I hope my accent isn't too strange." Sophie looked up from her fork balancing project and said in English with great satisfaction, "Dad speaks Chinese. He's been practicing with me." I had indeed. We had been doing 15 minutes of Mandarin every evening for the past 6 weeks. Sophie thought it was a game we were playing together. It was, in part. What followed was not dramatic in the way television has trained us to expect drama. No one shouted. No one left the table. We sat there in the specific Canadian silence of people who are going to be extremely polite about the worst moment of their lives. May said very quietly in English, "Since when?" I said, "Since always." I said it gently. I meant it to be gentle. I think it landed harder than a shout would have. The dinner ended soon after. Sophie was sent upstairs with Wei, who looked like he wanted to evaporate, and Raymond excused himself to the living room, and Linda sat very still and looked at nothing in particular. I cleared the dishes. May stood in the kitchen with her arms crossed, looking out at the backyard. And when I came in with the plates, she said, without turning around, "How much do you know?" I said, "Enough." She turned around. Her face was doing several things at once, and I recognized all of them. I had been married to her for 9 years. She said, "I was going to tell you." I said, "I know." And I did know. I don't think May was ever going to be able to maintain it indefinitely. She was many things, but she was not, at her core, comfortable with dishonesty. The fact that she had managed it for 2 years told me more about the pressure she was under than about her character. And I am not saying that to excuse her. I am saying it because it was true and because I needed, for my own sake, to be precise about what was true. What followed was a period of time I have no interest in describing in detail because it belonged to us in the way that certain painful things do. Specifically and privately, we told Sophie carefully that things were changing in the language we had always used with her, honest, direct, at her level, with room for questions. She had more questions than I expected and fewer tears than I feared. And that is Sophie, who has always moved through the world with a clarity I admire. The financial situation was addressed through the legal process that Patricia Sung had already set in motion. The money was recovered in large part, though not entirely. The question of what was owed, practically, morally, emotionally, is not one the courts fully answer. And I have made a kind of peace with that. Dana Whitmore is not a part of Sophie's life. And that was not solely my decision, which matters to me. Sophie knows the shape of things, not every detail, but the shape. She knows that her dad is her dad in the way that counts. She said that to me once, about 6 months after everything, sitting in the car outside her piano lesson, eating a box of Timbits because we had gotten there 20 minutes early. She said, "You're my real dad, right? Like, in the way that matters." I said, "Yes." She had a Timbit and said, "Okay," and looked out the window. That was enough. I still teach history in Oakville. I coach the junior debate team on Wednesday afternoons, which is exhausting and the best part of my week. Sophie is 10 now, and she is still correcting her teacher's grammar, and her Mandarin is, genuinely, better than most of the adults she's learned it alongside. And she uses it with her grandparents when they visit, which they still do, because she loves them, and because some things are not about the adults. I don't know what I expected to feel when I said that sentence at the dinner table in June. Relief, maybe. Satisfaction. The clean snap of a secret finally released. What I actually felt was something quieter and harder to name. Not triumph, not grief. Something that felt, eventually, like the beginning of a life I had actually chosen, rather than one that had simply accrued around me while I was being agreeable. Linda sends Sophie a red envelope every Lunar New Year. Inside the card she writes, in Mandarin, something I choose not to translate for Sophie until she is older and can decide what to do with it. For now, I tell Sophie her grandmother says she loves her, which is also in there. Which is also true. The world is usually several true things at once, and learning to hold that is perhaps the only lesson worth teaching. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a long deception, not peaceful quiet. The kind that sits in a room after the truth has finally been said out loud, and everyone is still adjusting to the new weight of the air. I think about that June dinner often, not with anger. The anger came and went a long time ago, in waves I mostly managed in private. On early morning walks along the lakeshore, when Sophie was still asleep. What I think about now is the moment I looked at Linda across the table and chose, after years of saying nothing, to finally speak. Not because I wanted to wound anyone, but because silence had stopped being a kindness and started being a kind of slow disappearing act. I had been disappearing from my own life, politely, agreeably, one untranslated conversation at a time. What I've come to understand is that honesty isn't a weapon you pick up in anger. It's a discipline you build slowly, often without recognition. I spent 4 years in China learning a language, And I spent 9 years in a marriage practicing a different kind of fluency. The fluency of keeping the peace, of not pushing, of trusting that things would sort themselves without my intervention. One of those skills served me well, the other one nearly cost me everything. The money, the lies, Daniel Whitmore. All of it was a consequence of a pattern. Not just May's pattern, mine too. I had created, without meaning to, a version of myself that the people around me believed would not notice, would not push back, would not know. He notices nothing, Wei said. That's not a judgment that arrives from nowhere. That's a judgment that gets confirmed repeatedly by a man who keeps smiling and reaching for the hot sauce. What changed me, what the whole experience forced me to build, was a kind of clear-eyed steadiness I don't think I had before. Not toughness in the hard, closed-off sense. More like the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable truth long enough to understand its full shape before acting on it. To call Patricia Sung instead of confronting May in the kitchen. To collect the evidence quietly. To wait until I knew what I was actually dealing with, rather than reacting to what I feared. That took something I can only describe as a refusal to be swept along. A decision, made daily, to remain a person who thinks before he acts and acts on what he actually knows. And Sophie taught me something I wasn't expecting. She reminded me that integrity, the real, quiet, unglamorous kind, isn't something you perform at the moment of confrontation. It's something you demonstrate in the 10,000 small decisions that nobody sees. It's in the 15 minutes of Mandarin every evening. It's in telling her the shape of things without burdening her with details she can't carry yet. It's in showing up to piano pickup with Timbits and an honest answer when she asks a straight question. I don't think the choices I made were perfect. I think they were the best I could do with what I had, made by a man who was trying, genuinely, to act with some measure of integrity in a situation that didn't lend itself to clean decisions. That's what I tell anyone in a version of this situation. Not that it gets easy, but that clarity is available to you if you're willing to be honest first with yourself, about what you know, about what you've been choosing not to see, about the person you want to be on the other side of it. Sophie is 10 now. Her Mandarin is better than mine was at 24, and she uses it with her grandparents, and she laughs easily, and she trusts me. That trust is not something I inherited or was given. It is something I chose, every day, to be worth.